The viewport of the Solace was a cold, impenetrable sheet of reinforced glass, but even it couldn't block the emptiness that stretched beyond. Dr. Lysandra Cade stood at the helm, watching the graveyard emerge from the dark, a chaos of jagged, lifeless hulks suspended in the void. The sight twisted her stomach in a way no academic study ever could. This wasn't just a graveyard of ships. It was a mass grave of hope, ambition, and every soul that had once dreamed of the stars. "Looks like a goddamn scrapyard," Desh muttered behind her. The ship's mechanic scratched his wiry beard, his voice thick with disdain. "Hardly seems worth risking our necks for some old fairy tale." "It's not a fairy tale," Lysandra snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. "The subspace conduit is real. I've seen the records. She stopped herself, closing her eyes. Desperation was creeping into her voice, and that wouldn't help. "It's our best chance, our only chance." Desh scoffed, but said nothing more. The others were equally silent, their unease palpable. The Solace was small, claustrophobic even, with quarters too tight to escape anyone's mood. The air felt thin, every breath carrying the weight of unspoken fears. Lysandra turned her attention back to the controls. The graveyard was vast, a tangle of ancient vessels that stretched for miles in every direction. Some were massive dreadnoughts, their hulls scarred by battles long forgotten. Others were smaller, sleeker ships, their designs alien and unrecognizable. All were dead, their lights extinguished, their systems cold. And somewhere among them was the Vanguard Horizon. Her hands moved over the controls, guiding the Solace toward the massive cruiser at the center of the graveyard. Its silhouette loomed like a dark monolith, its edges jagged and broken. It was clear, even from this distance, that the ship had suffered greatly. Entire sections were missing, torn away as if by some colossal force. The thought made her shiver. "Are you sure about this one?" Cal's voice crackled over the comms. He was perched in the gunner's seat, scanning for potential threats. Not that there was anything left alive out here. Probably. Looks like it's about to fall apart. "It's the most intact ship in the graveyard," Lysandra replied. "If the conduit's anywhere, it'll be on the horizon." "And if it's not," Lysandra hesitated, "then we find another ship. We don't leave until we find it." The silence that followed was heavy with doubt, but no one challenged her. They all knew what was at stake. Earth was dying. The last of humanity was clinging to life in orbital stations that were falling apart, their resources dwindling. If they couldn't find a way to the stars, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. As the Solace approached the Vanguard Horizon, Lysandra felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had fought for this mission, argued with everyone who doubted her, sacrificed what little remained of her reputation. Now, standing on the edge of the unknown, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Docking with the Vanguard Horizon was no small feat. The ship's docking bay was dark, its systems offline, forcing them to rely on manual controls. Desh grumbled curses under his breath as he wrestled with the Solace's thrusters, guiding the ship into position. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hull, setting Lysandra's teeth on edge. "Docking clamps engaged," Desh announced. "Not pretty, but it'll hold." "Good work," Lysandra said. She turned to the others, her voice firm. "Gear up. We don't know what we're walking into." The airlock hissed open, revealing the Vanguard Horizon's docking bay. The air inside was stale, tinged with a metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. Their helmet lights cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was eerily still. Broken crates and scattered tools littered the floor, but there was no sign of life. No bodies, no blood, just emptiness. Creepy as hell, Cal muttered, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Lysandra ignored him, her attention focused on the walls. They were covered in strange growths, patches of greenish-black fungi that pulsed faintly, as if alive. She reached out to touch one, but Desh grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he said, his voice low. "You don't know what that stuff is." She pulled her hand back, swallowing her irritation. He was right. The fungi weren't in any of the records she'd studied, which meant they were something new, something dangerous. She made a mental note to collect a sample later, assuming they lived long enough. "Split up," she said, her voice echoing in the empty bay. "Desh, you're with me. Cal, you and Rena check the upper levels. Look for anything that might point us to the conduit." "And if we find something that wants to eat us?" Cal asked. "Run," Lysandra said simply, "and scream loud enough for us to hear." The corridors of the Vanguard Horizon were a maze of decay. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. The walls seemed to close in around them, the fungal growths growing thicker the deeper they went. Lysandra couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though her scanner picked up nothing but faint energy readings. "Why'd they leave it like this?" Desh asked as they passed a control room, its consoles shattered and dark. "This was a top-tier ship. You'd think they'd strip it for parts before abandoning it." Lysandra didn't answer. She had her theories, but none of them were comforting. The log she'd read suggested the Horizon's mission had been classified, its crew forbidden to contact the outside world. Whatever had happened here, it had been enough to make them abandon ship. Or worse, a sudden sound made them both freeze, a faint scratching like nails on metal. It came from somewhere ahead, just out of sight. Lysandra's heart pounded as she raised her weapon, the small plasma pistol feeling woefully inadequate in her grip. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Desh nodded, his face pale. They moved forward slowly, their lights cutting through the darkness. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a sealed door at the end of the corridor. Lysandra's hand hovered over the control panel, her fingers trembling. "Don't," Desh said, his voice barely audible. "We don't need to know." "Yes, we do," Lysandra replied. She pressed the button and the door slid open with a groan. The room beyond was empty, save for the walls. They were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something had been clawing to get out. "Lys, we need to leave," Desh said, backing away. Lysandra stared at the marks, her mind racing. Something had been trapped here, something that wasn't here anymore. And then, from somewhere deep within the ship, came the sound of metal bending under immense pressure, a sound that was unmistakably alive. The corridors of the Vanguard Horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, a disorienting network of decay and desolation. The ship had been adrift for centuries, but it felt older, as though time had twisted its interior into something alien. The faint green glow of the fungal growths offered the only light, casting grotesque shadows that flickered like ghostly figures on the walls. Every step felt heavier, as if the ship itself resented their intrusion. Dr. Lysandra Cade adjusted her scanner, the device whining as it tried to process the strange energy readings emanating from the ship. The organism, if that's what the fungi were, was alive. Not just alive, but active. It pulsed in slow rhythmic waves, synchronized across the ship's interior. Lysandra felt as though she was walking through the veins of some colossal creature, its heartbeat vibrating beneath her feet. Anything. Cal's voice crackled over the comms. He and Rena had taken the upper decks while Lysandra and Desh searched the engineering levels. Just more of this. Growth, Lysandra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's everywhere. I've never seen anything like it. Yeah, well, keep your distance from it, Cal said. Rena says it's moving. She swears she saw it shift when we passed through the mess hall. Desh muttered a curse under his breath. Fantastic. Sentient space mold. Just what we needed. Focus, Lysandra snapped, though she felt the same growing unease. The conduit has to be here somewhere. Keep looking. The team pressed on, the silence of the ship broken only by the occasional groan of metal settling under invisible stress. The air was thick and stale, a metallic tang burning at the back of their throats. Lysandra tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder to breathe, harder to think. The logs were in the Horizon's command center, a cavernous room that had once been the brain of the ship. Now it was a graveyard of its own, broken terminals, shattered displays, and the skeletal remains of the bridge crew slumped in their chairs. The bodies were disturbingly intact, preserved in the dry air of the derelict. Lysandra moved carefully among them, her gloves brushing against brittle uniforms as she accessed the ship's main console. Desh lingered near the doorway, his eyes darting to every shadow. This place gives me the creeps. Feels like we're not supposed to be here. We're not, Lysandra said without looking up. That's why we are. The console flickered to life under her touch, its cracked screen displaying a distorted version of the ship's log. Most of the files were corrupted, but a few still played. Lysandra selected the last intact entry and stepped back as a hologram of the Horizon's captain appeared, the figure flickering in and out of focus. We found it, the captain's voice rasped, his face pale and gaunt. On the surface of Alpha 88, a life form. No, a force. We thought it was inert, dead, but it's not. It's awake now, The log glitched, the captain's image twisting violently before cutting out. Lysandra cursed and tried another file. We've sealed it off, a second voice, this one a woman, said hurriedly. The engineering team's working on containment, but it's not enough. It's spreading through the ventilation systems. We can't. The voice faltered, and the woman glanced behind her, fear etched into her face. If anyone finds this ship, leave it. Destroy it. Don't let... The log cut out again, leaving only static. Don't let what? Desh asked, his voice cracking. He stepped closer to the screen, his breath fogging the air. Lysandra didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the hologram, her mind racing. Whatever the Horizon's crew had found, it wasn't just some artifact. It was alive, and it was still here. In the Horizon's engineering bay, the air was colder, heavier, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The fungal growths had overtaken this section entirely, forming thick tendrils that wove through the machinery like parasitic veins. The walls glistened with a slick organic sheen that made Lysandra's stomach churn. At the center of the bay, they found the subspace conduit. It was larger than she'd imagined, a towering structure of alien design embedded in the ship's core. Its surface was smooth and black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Strange symbols pulsed faintly across its surface, their meaning just beyond comprehension. Lysandra reached out to touch it, but stopped herself. Something about it felt wrong. "This is it," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "The conduit." Desh approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the tendrils wrapped around the base of the device. "What's it doing here? This tech isn't human. Hell, it doesn't look like anything I've seen before." "It's not," Lysandra said, her scanner humming as it analyzed the device. "The Horizon's crew must have recovered it from Alpha 88. They probably didn't even know what they were dealing with." "Yeah, and look how that turned out for them," Desh muttered, glancing at the fungal-coated walls. "You really think this thing is worth it?" Lysandra didn't answer. She knew the risks, knew the cost. But what choice did they have? The conduit was humanity's only chance to escape the dying cradle of Earth. Without it, there was no future. A sudden noise made them both freeze, a wet, squelching sound, like something pulling itself free from a viscous liquid. Lysandra spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the bay. The tendrils around the conduit were shifting, coiling tighter as though reacting to their presence. "Lys, we've got a problem," Desh said, backing away. His voice was shaking. "I think it's waking up." The sound of metal creaking under immense pressure echoed through the ship, followed by a distant, inhuman shriek that reverberated through the corridors. Lysandra's heart pounded as she grabbed Desh's arm and pulled him toward the exit. "Run!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. They sprinted through the twisting corridors, the fungal growths seeming to writhe in response to their movement. The walls pulsed faster now, the green glow intensifying until it bathed the ship in a sickly, otherworldly light. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, wet, slithering noises punctuated by guttural growls that made Lysandra's blood run cold. They reached the docking bay just as Cal and Rena appeared from the upper levels, their faces pale with terror. "What the hell is going on?" Cal shouted. "No time," Lysandra yelled. "Get to the ship." The Solace's airlock loomed ahead, but the sound of pursuit was deafening now. Lysandra chanced to glance over her shoulder and saw them. Twisted forms, barely recognizable as human, their bodies fused with the fungal growths. Their mouths gaped open in silent screams, their eyes glowing with an alien intelligence. The first of the creatures lunged, its elongated limbs reaching for Desh. He fired his plasma cutter, the beam slicing through its arm, but the creature didn't slow. It swiped at him with its remaining limb, sending him crashing into the wall. "Desh!" Lysandra screamed, but he waved her off. "Go!" he shouted, blood dripping from his forehead. "Get the damn conduit!" Lysandra hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning and running, the creatures closing in behind her. The Solace's airlock hissed open, and she stumbled inside, gasping for breath. As the door sealed shut, she heard Desh's final scream, followed by the wet sound of flesh being torn apart. The Vanguard Horizon was no longer just a derelict. It was alive. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, its metallic tang now overpowered by a cloying organic musk. The walls, once lined with dormant fungal growth, had transformed into pulsating masses of flesh-like tissue. Green and black veins snaked across the surfaces, pulsing in rhythmic synchronization. The ship wasn't just infested, it was part of the organism now, and it had begun to wake. Dr. Lysandra Cade clutched her plasma pistol tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. She led Cal and Rena deeper into the ship, every step feeling like a journey into the bowels of some living nightmare. Desh's scream still echoed in her mind, but she couldn't afford to mourn him. Not now. They needed to find the subspace conduit, and they needed to get out before the ship consumed them too. "Tell me we're not just walking in circles," Cal said, his voice tense. He held his rifle at the ready, scanning every shadow with paranoid precision. "We're following the strongest energy readings," Lysandra replied, not looking back. Her handheld scanner beeped faintly, its screen glowing with an erratic pattern of spikes and drops. "The conduit is in the lower decks. We're close." "And how exactly do you plan to rip it out of whatever hellish nightmare it's fused to?" Rena asked, her voice trembling. She was breathing heavily, her medkit bouncing against her hip with every step. "You saw what happened to Desh. That thing tore him apart like wet paper." "I'll figure it out," Lysandra snapped, more harshly than she intended. "The conduit is our only chance. If we don't get it, we're dead anyway." "Better dead here than dragging that thing back to Earth," Rena muttered under her breath. But Lysandra pretended not to hear. She couldn't let their fear infect her resolve, even as her own doubts clawed at the edges of her mind. The group reached a junction where the corridor split into 3 paths. The growths were denser here, the walls bulging with swollen pods that oozed a viscous black liquid. Lysandra's scanner emitted a high-pitched whine as it struggled to process the readings. The energy signature was strongest down the left passage, but something about it felt wrong. The air was heavier, charged with a static that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "This way," she said, pointing left. Cal hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Because that looks like the kind of hallway where people die in horror vids." "We don't have time to argue," Lysandra said, already moving. "Stay close." The passage narrowed as they progressed, the walls pressing in on either side. The fleshy growths pulsated faster now, and Lysandra swore she could feel the floor vibrating beneath her boots. She kept her eyes on the scanner, focusing on the energy spikes, trying to ignore the oppressive sense of being watched. Then came the sound. A wet, slithering noise echoed from somewhere ahead, like something massive dragging itself across the floor. The group froze, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The passage ahead curved sharply, hiding whatever lay beyond. "What the hell is that?" Rena whispered, her voice trembling. Lysandra shook her head, motioning for them to move slowly. They crept forward, their footsteps agonizingly loud against the fleshy floor. The sound grew louder, closer, until they rounded the corner and saw it. A creature loomed in the corridor, its form a grotesque amalgamation of human and alien. It had once been a member of the Horizon's crew. Its tattered uniform clung to a body that was now elongated and warped, its limbs fused with the fungal growths. Black, oily tendrils sprouted from its back, writhing like snakes. Its head snapped toward them, its mouth splitting open in a horrific, tooth-lined maw. For a moment, no one moved. Then the creature lunged. "Run!" Lysandra shouted, firing her plasma pistol. The shot hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. It moved unnaturally fast, its limbs contorting as it scrambled toward them. Cal fired his rifle, the bursts of energy lighting up the corridor, but the creature kept coming. Rena screamed as one of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her leg. She fell hard, her medkit scattering across the floor. Lysandra grabbed her arm, pulling with all her strength as the creature dragged her closer. "Help me!" Rena screamed, tears streaming down her face. Cal fired again, this time hitting one of the tendrils. It recoiled with a high-pitched screech, releasing Rena. Lysandra yanked her to her feet and they ran, the creature's inhuman wails echoing behind them. They didn't stop until they reached a large chamber that appeared to be some kind of control room. The walls here were less overtaken by growths, though the air was still thick with the organism's presence. Lysandra collapsed against a console, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "What the hell was that thing?" Cal demanded, his face pale. "It's the organism," Lysandra said, her voice shaking. "It's assimilating the crew, transforming them." Rena sat on the floor, clutching her injured leg. The tendril had left a deep gash, and black veins were already spreading from the wound. "I can feel it," she whispered. "It's inside me." "No," Lysandra said firmly, kneeling beside her. "We'll stop it. We'll find a way." "How?" Rena snapped, tears streaming down her face. "You don't even know what this thing is. You're just dragging us to our deaths for some stupid machine." Lysandra opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She didn't have an answer. All she had was desperation. She turned her attention to the console, its interface flickering to life. The ship's schematics appeared, overlaid with faint energy signatures. The conduit was close, just one deck below. But the organism was everywhere, its tendrils marked as glowing red veins that spread through the ship like a cancer. "We're almost there," Lysandra said, more to herself than the others. "We just need to—" A loud crash interrupted her. The creature had found them. It barreled into the room, its tendrils lashing out wildly. Cal opened fire, his shots tearing chunks from its body, but it didn't slow. The creature lunged at him, slamming him against the wall with a sickening crunch. He fell limp, blood pooling beneath him. Lysandra grabbed Rena, dragging her toward the exit. "We have to move," Rena resisted, her body trembling. I can't. The black veins had spread up her leg, creeping toward her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears mixing with sweat. "You can," Lysandra shouted, pulling her harder. But as she looked into Rena's eyes, she saw the truth. The infection was too far gone. Rena pushed her away, her face twisted with pain. "Go," she whispered, "before it takes me." Lysandra hesitated, tears stinging her eyes. Then the creature roared, and she had no choice. She ran. As she fled down the corridor, Rena's screams echoed behind her, followed by an eerie silence. Then the ship shifted again, the walls closing in as the organism moved to claim its prey. Lysandra didn't stop running until she reached the lower deck. The conduit was close. She could feel its energy, a faint hum that resonated through the walls. But she was alone now, and the ship was alive, and it was hunting her. The walls of the Vanguard Horizon's lower deck pulsated like the interior of a living thing. Fleshy growths throbbed with an unnatural rhythm, their black veins weaving into every surface. The ship no longer resembled the technological marvel it once was. It had transformed into a grotesque, bioorganic labyrinth. Every step Lysandra Cade took felt heavier, as though the ship was fighting her progress, the ground shifting beneath her boots. She could hear it now, the deep, resonant hum of the subspace conduit, growing louder with each step, vibrating through the marrow of her bones. It was close, the device that could save humanity, Earth's last hope, was waiting at the heart of this nightmare, but the closer she got, the more the ship seemed to react. The walls constricted, tendrils slithered along the floor, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, predatory growl. She was utterly alone. Cal was dead. Rena was gone, claimed by the infection, her screams silenced by assimilation. Even Desh's memory felt like a ghost at her side, his final cry still echoing in her mind. Lysandra clung to the last shreds of her resolve, forcing herself forward. Earth was depending on her. Everyone she had ever loved, every soul she had ever known, they were all counting on her to succeed. Failure wasn't an option. The chamber housing the subspace conduit was enormous, impossibly vast compared to the rest of the ship. Its walls curved upward, forming a dome that seemed to stretch into infinity, the green glow of the organism casting long, shifting shadows. The conduit stood at the center, its alien architecture both beautiful and horrifying. Black as the void, its smooth surface rippled with faint light, ancient symbols dancing across its surface in a language Lysandra couldn't begin to understand. Tendrils of the organism were wrapped around its base, pulsating as though feeding from it. The air was alive with energy, each breath burning her lungs. She approached cautiously, the hum of the conduit growing louder, deeper, resonating through her entire body. Her handheld scanner flickered wildly, its readings incomprehensible. But she didn't need the device to know the truth. The conduit was active, alive, and it was waiting. Lysandra circled the conduit, searching for a way to activate it. Her fingers brushed over the smooth surface, which was oddly warm, like flesh rather than metal. As she examined it, her eyes caught movement from the tendrils surrounding its base. They twitched, then coiled back as though in pain. The hum shifted, becoming a low, guttural sound. A vibration beneath her feet made her stumble, and she realized too late that the conduit wasn't the only thing in the room. From the shadows behind the device, something stirred. It rose slowly, unfolding itself from the walls and floor, its body a grotesque fusion of metal, flesh, and fungal growths. It was massive, its form vaguely humanoid but entirely wrong. Its limbs too long, its torso twisted, its head an elongated mass of jagged bone and glistening tendrils. Its eyes, or what passed for them, were black pits that seemed to absorb all light. It wasn't just part of the organism. It was the organism. Lysandra froze, her breath caught in her throat as the creature's gaze locked onto her. For a moment, neither moved. Then it lunged. She threw herself to the side as one of its tendrils lashed out, smashing into the floor where she had stood. The force of the impact sent her sprawling, her plasma pistol skittering out of reach. The creature roared, a sound so loud it felt like it was coming from inside her own skull. Lysandra scrambled to her feet, heart pounding as the creature advanced. Its movements were deliberate, almost predatory, as if it was savoring the chase. Her eyes darted to the conduit. She could see now that it had a core, a circular panel at its center that pulsed with a bright white light. It was an interface, she realized, a way to activate it. But the tendrils wrapped around it were tightening, as though trying to shield it from her. She had no choice. She had to reach it. The creature lunged again, its tendrils slicing through the air. Lysandra dove forward, rolling beneath the strike and coming up just feet from the conduit. She slammed her hands against the interface, her fingers searching for a way to activate it. Symbols flared to life beneath her touch, the alien patterns shifting rapidly, rearranging themselves as though responding to her desperation. The hum grew louder, the conduit's energy intensifying. But nothing happened. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no! Work, damn it!" The creature roared behind her, its tendrils whipping toward her. She spun around, ducking as one narrowly missed her head. Another struck her leg, sending her sprawling against the conduit's base. Pain flared in her side, but she ignored it, pulling herself up and slamming her fist against the interface. "Please," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, work!" The symbols stopped shifting. A new pattern appeared, one she hadn't seen before. A single word flashed in her mind, not spoken but somehow understood. Sacrifice. Lysandra froze. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The conduit didn't just require activation, it demanded a life force to power it. Not as fuel, but as a catalyst, it needed her. The creature was still advancing, its tendrils spreading out, encircling her. There was no time to think, no time to doubt. She thought of Earth, the crumbling cities, the starving children, the endless fields of ash where forests had once stood. She thought of the people she had left behind, the ones who still believed she could save them. Her hand trembled as she reached for the core of the conduit. The light intensified, engulfing her, searing her skin and filling her with a searing pain that made her scream. The conduit's hum became a deafening roar, and the creature screeched in response, its tendrils lashing wildly as the energy engulfed them both. Lysandra felt herself dissolving, her body breaking apart, her mind fracturing into a million pieces. But even as the pain consumed her, she smiled. She had done it. The conduit activated with a blinding flash of light, sending a shockwave through the Vanguard Horizon. The organism shrieked in agony as the energy tore through it, burning it away. The ship trembled violently, its walls collapsing in on themselves, the flesh-like growths dissolving into ash. And then, silence. Centuries later, a salvage crew stumbled upon the graveyard of starships. They found the Vanguard Horizon, its remains drifting silently among the wreckage. The ship was dark, its interior scorched and lifeless. But at its center they found the subspace conduit. It stood untouched, its surface smooth and black, its symbols faintly glowing. One of the crew reached out to touch it, their curiosity overriding their caution. And deep within the conduit, something stirred.